The accusation came at the worst possible table. Graham Halcott, 41-year-old Chief Executive Officer of Halcott Logistics Group and husband of Raina, dropped a bound folder in front of her at the company's annual leadership dinner, a black folder stamped confidential in red, surrounded by crystal glasses and untouched appetizers and the eyes of every senior partner in the room. $22 million moved through property transfers you arranged, he said. Every signature belongs to you. Raina Kincaid Halcott, 36-year-old director of the Kincaid Community Housing Foundation and wife of Graham, did not reach for the folder immediately. She recognized the weight of the moment before she recognized anything inside it. The seat beside Graham was occupied by Vesna Dral, 31-year-old head of strategic acquisitions for Halcott Logistics, holding a glass of wine as though the chair had always been hers. Raina's usual place at the table had been removed. A single chair waited at the far end, positioned beneath the only overhead light, bright enough to make someone look like they were being interrogated. No one had called this a dinner. They had called it an opportunity to address internal financial concerns before the press discovered them first. Inside the folder were deed transfer documents bearing Raina's notarized signature. A corporate entity called Kincaid Foundation Holdings appeared on each page as the transferring party. The transfers moved the ground lease on the Halcott Logistics headquarters tower, a 12-story building in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, to an investment group that happened to be a direct competitor. Theodora Halcott, 65-year-old mother of Graham and matriarch of the Halcott family enterprise, looked at Raina from across the table with the particular expression she had been rehearsing for years. You came into this family with nothing but a charity title and a trust fund no one could verify, Theodora said. And the moment we stopped watching closely, you found a way to take what was never yours. Raina looked at Graham. You know I did not sign these documents. Graham looked away. Osbert Rains, 58-year-old Halcott family attorney responsible for the legal filings placed before Raina that evening, opened a second folder. Inside was a divorce petition already bearing Graham's signature. Beside it sat a proposed settlement demanding that Raina forfeit her marital property, waive any financial claims, accept responsibility for the fraudulent deed transfers, and agree to leave Charlotte within 60 days. Raina picked up the pen. She signed the acknowledgement confirming she had received the divorce petition. She signed a written statement agreeing that the marriage should end. When Osbert slid the proposed settlement toward her, the one requiring a confession to fraud she had never committed, she returned it unsigned. I will end this marriage, she said. I will not confess to crimes I did not commit. Graham leaned back in his chair. He had expected tears. He received composure, and composure was the only thing in that room he could not control. Before another word was spoken, the private dining room doors opened, and 2 investigators from the Charlotte Financial Crimes Unit entered with a warrant. Graham had filed the formal complaint 8 days before he arranged this dinner. He had arranged this dinner only after learning that the warrant was already approved. Raina's hands were still flat on the table when Marsh Keller, 46-year-old financial crimes attorney and legal counsel to the Kincaid Family Trust, walked through the same door and identified himself as her representative. She looked at him. Preserve every lease document, access log, and digital transfer record tied to the Halcott Tower property. Then the restraints came. Graham reached for Vesna's hand. Vesna remained seated in Raina's former chair. Raina did not look at them again. She looked straight ahead, because she knew something Graham had spent 11 years underestimating. She was not only the woman he had married, she was Raina Delara Kincaid, sole controlling heir to the Kincaid Property Trust, the private real estate holding company that owned the building Graham Halcott called his company's address. 4 months before that dinner, Raina had left her own foundation event early because Graham called. The Kincaid Community Housing Foundation was hosting its annual housing fair at the Midtown Convention Center. 64 families were being matched that afternoon with affordable housing placement services, financial counseling, and emergency lease assistance. Raina had coordinated the entire program for 11 weeks. Her phone rang at 12:47 p.m. Graham did not greet her. The lease renewal terms on the tower came back wrong. Legal doesn't understand the escalation clause. If you can bother yourself to leave whatever you're managing, I need the figures corrected before 4 o'clock. Behind Raina, a family with 3 children was waiting to speak with a housing counselor. A woman in her 70s was trying to navigate a stack of forms she could not read without help. How long do you need me? Raina asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. I'll be there in 30 minutes. She handed the program coordinator her binder, whispered instructions for the afternoon's remaining sessions, and left while a room full of people she had invited were still finding their chairs. At Halcott Logistics, the problem was immediately clear. The commercial lease for the downtown tower had been drafted by outside counsel who had confused a fixed-rate escalation schedule with a market-indexed one. Over the next 7 years of the renewal term, the error would cost the company an additional $4.1 million in overpayments. Rayner corrected the clause language, identified 2 additional provisions the attorneys had misread, and drafted a clean amendment summary in 90 minutes. Anson Halcott, 68-year-old chairman emeritus and father of Graham, stood near the window when she finished. "The lease is that building's most important document," he said slowly. "The building is worth protecting," Rayner answered. She did not say what she knew about that building that none of them did. Vesna Drayle arrived carrying Graham's afternoon coffee order without being asked. She handed him the cup, leaned over his desk to review the amendment summary Rayner had written, and used the access code to unlock his office tablet without hesitating. She had memorized the code. Graham accepted the coffee and thanked Vesna before he acknowledged what Rayner had spent 90 minutes correcting. "Good catch on the escalation clause," he said, already turning toward his next call. That was the full extent of it. Rayner returned to the housing fair in time to close the program. She stayed afterward to help a family whose placement had fallen through at the last moment, driving them personally to a partner organization across town before the office closed. Graham was not home when she returned. His phone went to voicemail. 3 weeks later, Rayner sat inside the secure archive room beneath the Kincaid Foundation's administrative office and listened to Marsh explain what he had found. "Someone has been using your name," Marsh said, "in connection with property transfers you never authorized." He placed 4 documents across the table: deed transfer applications, a corporate filing for an entity called Kincaid Foundation Holdings, a name designed to appear connected to her real nonprofit, a notarized signature block carrying a perfect reproduction of her signature from a legitimate grant document, and a wire transfer authorization memo, routing $22 million through 3 shell companies before arriving at a competitor investment group's acquisition account. "The entity that initiated the transfers was incorporated using a copy of your identification and your old foundation address," Marsh said. "The notarization stamp came from an office supply store, but the signature itself," he set a magnification comparison on the table, "came from a lease assistance agreement you signed for the Morningside Housing Cooperative 18 months ago." Rayner stared at the 2 signatures side by side. They were identical in every detail: the small ink-heavy curve at the base of the R, the slight lift before the N, a microscopic pause in the middle stroke that no person ever intentionally reproduced. It had been copied, not forged from memory, reproduced from an original. "Could Graham have obtained that document?" she asked. Marsh studied her before answering. "The Morningside file was housed in the shared records system. He had access until you separated the passwords 14 months ago." Rayner thought about the afternoon. Graham had asked to review old foundation documents for what he called a tax consulting purpose. He had borrowed her laptop for 3 hours. She had not thought to ask what he had copied. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Does this connect to the building?" Marsh opened a second folder, the Kincaid Property Trust, a private real estate holding company established by her grandfather Arden Kincaid, who had spent 40 years assembling one of the largest private commercial portfolios in the Carolinas before his death, still owned the ground lease on the Halcott Logistics Tower through a layered trust structure known only to Rayner, her estate attorneys, and the trust's independent directors. Graham had signed their prenuptial agreement acknowledging that Rayner held a protected premarital trust. He had never asked what the trust held. She had never volunteered it, partly because trust confidentiality rules prohibited disclosure, and partly because she had wanted, for once in her adult life, to be loved without the weight of her grandfather's name. The shell transfers appear designed to move title of the tower lease out of the trust's ownership and into a competitor's acquisition portfolio, Marsh said. If they succeeded, Graham's company would be paying rent to his rival. Rayner was quiet. Then, who benefits from that arrangement? Marsh placed the competitor acquisition group's beneficial ownership registry on the table. One name appeared as a secondary investor: Vesna Drayle. The evidence arrived in pieces after that, each one colder than the last. A payment record showed Vesna had received $180,000 from one of the shell entities 3 months before the deed transfers were filed. Graham's calendar showed him entering Osbert Raines's private office on 4 separate occasions during the weeks the fraudulent documents were being assembled. A building security log showed Vesna entering the Halcott executive floor at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, hours after the last employee had swiped out, carrying a bag she had not signed in. Rainer found all of this before the dinner. She also found something that made her grief go cold in a specific, clarifying way. 6 days before Graham called to tell her about the lease escalation problem, the problem he had used to pull her away from her own event, he had filed the criminal complaint. The complaint described Rainer as a fraudulent actor who had used her non-profit's name to manufacture false property transfers. He had invented the leasing emergency to get her out of the building, to make her look cooperative while she was already being investigated. She attended the dinner anyway, because Marsh told her it was the best way to understand what evidence they had assembled and what Graham intended to do with it. She did not go unprepared. Before entering the private dining room, she photographed everything in her handbag and texted the images to Marsh with a timestamp. She wore her grandfather's watch, a quiet detail only she understood. She carried no laptop, no flash drive, no company document. She had already asked the Kincaid Trust's independent directors to issue a preservation hold on every document connected to the building's title history. None of it made what happened inside that room easier to experience. When Theodora looked at her with years of accumulated in contempt and said, "You entered this family with nothing," Rainer felt the full length of how long she had been underestimated in that house. Not because the insult was accurate, but because it had been comfortable. It was always more convenient for the Halcott family to believe Rainer was decorative than to consider she might be capable. When the restraints closed around her wrists and Graham reached for Vesna's hand without looking back, Rainer understood something she had been delaying for years. The marriage had not ended that night. It had ended on all the afternoons she had corrected his work without being thanked, on all the evenings she returned to an empty house after helping strangers, on the night she found a receipt in his jacket for a restaurant he had told her was closed for renovation. She had stayed because she believed in the man she had married 11 years ago. That man was gone. What remained had used her signature to build a crime. The holding cell was quiet after midnight. A television in the corridor replayed footage of Rainer being walked out of the building. The news identified her as a non-profit director accused of manipulating commercial real estate deeds worth tens of millions. The report used photographs provided by the Halcott family, showing Graham at charity galas and leadership conferences while Rainer appeared in soft focus behind him. The report did not mention that Rainer had corrected the very lease document protecting the building at the center of the case. It did not mention the $22 million transfer initiated while she was seated at a table surrounded by 12 witnesses. It did not mention that her signature had been lifted from a document she had signed for a housing cooperative. A detention officer quietly lowered the television volume. "You don't have to keep watching," the officer said. "They aren't reporting what happened," Rainer said. "They're reporting what someone handed them." She thought of her grandfather. He had pulled her from public succession records when a business profile identified her as his heir, and a car followed her home from school. She had been 14. 2 men had approached her at the entrance to the parking structure, and her grandfather's personal driver had stepped between them. After that, Arden Kincaid taught her to live without displaying what she owned. He taught her that a name attached to money became a target before it became anything else. She had carried that lesson into her marriage. She had believed that if she made Graham feel capable, helped him with his lease reviews, his board presentations, his quarterly numbers, he would eventually stop needing to diminish her. She understood now that she had been wrong. Not about him, about herself. She had spent 11 years shrinking so he could feel taller, and she had done it quietly enough that he had come to believe she had nothing to stand on. Webb Calleran, 50-year-old independent forensic accountant retained by the Kincaid Trust, had already found the timestamp contradictions before Rainer's second morning in custody. The notarization on 2 of the transfer documents predated the shell entity's official registration by 11 days. The wire routing memo used a banking format Rainer's trust had discontinued 3 years ago. Most significantly, the transfer approval that moved funds into the competitor's acquisition account had been initiated from an IP address registered to Vesna Drall's home network. At the exact hour Rainer was seated in the dining room in front of every senior partner Graham had invited to witness the accusation. Marsh presented the contradictions to investigators the morning after the arrest. Blythe Carrow, 44-year-old lead investigator for the Charlotte Financial Crimes Unit, did not dismiss them. She requested the full server records. By the following morning, she had a different set of questions, and most of them were addressed to Vesna. When Reiner was released on bond 4 days later, she did not return to the Halcott house. Her belongings had been packed, broken frames, clothes folded wrong, a box of her grandfather's photographs with the corner crushed. On top of the box sat a note from Theodora. Women who steal do not deserve soft exits. Reiner held one photograph for a long time. It showed her and her grandfather standing on the sidewalk outside the downtown tower the spring before he died. He had taken her there without telling her it was in the trust's portfolio. He had looked up at the glass facade and said, "Some people build things so they can look important. Your great-uncle built this one because the workers inside needed a building that wouldn't flood." She had thought he was teaching her about construction. She understood now that he had been teaching her what it meant to hold something in trust, to own something powerful, and be responsible for using it honestly. By the end of that week, Webb's reconstruction was complete. Every element of the fraud traced clearly. The deed transfer documents had been assembled using Reiner's photocopied identification, an expired notary stamp purchased online, a cloned digital signature, and a corporate structure designed to look like an offshoot of her legitimate foundation. Every payment from the shell entities traced to accounts connected to Vesna. Graham's building security access log showed him entering the executive floor during the exact window when the original fraudulent filing had been timestamped, and his personal email contained a message to Osbert Raines, sent 3 months before the dinner, that read in part, "She still doesn't know the building's actual title chain. Keep the transfer filing quiet until the warrant is confirmed." He had believed that Reiner did not know the building was in the Kincaid Trust. He had never asked, he had assumed. Blythe Carrow presented her findings to the prosecutor's office on a Thursday. The charges against Reiner were placed under immediate review. By Friday, the lead prosecutor filed a motion to dismiss. That same afternoon, Graham entered the Halcott Logistics offices, expecting to finalize the company's largest contract of the year, a logistics management agreement for a regional pharmaceutical distributor, payable through a draw on the company's commercial real estate line of credit. The line of credit was secured against the tower building. At 2 p.m., he opened the banking dashboard and attempted to initiate the draw. The screen returned a restriction notice, property title dispute pending independent verification, associated credit facility suspended per lender protocol, contact trust counsel. He tried the secondary account, then the acquisition reserve. Each one returned a version of the same message. He called the trust administrator's office. A calm voice answered and told him the ground lease on the tower was under active title review, initiated by the property trust's controlling beneficiary. "I need to speak with whoever is overseeing that trust," Graham said. "The controlling beneficiary has recused herself from all operational decisions involving accounts connected to Halcott Logistics. Independent Trust Counsel is managing the review." Graham hung up and looked at the contract on his desk, at the pharmaceutical distributor's signature line, still waiting for him to release the initial payment. He did not know yet who was waiting in the conference room at the top of the building he thought he controlled. The Kincaid Trust had arranged the meeting without announcement. A formal summons was delivered through proper legal channels to the Halcott Board of Directors and Osbert Raines, requesting their presence at a title clarification hearing in the building's executive conference suite. Graham arrived with Anson beside him, Theodora 2 steps behind, Osbert carrying a briefcase of property records he believed would prove the deed transfers were legitimate foundation activity. He found independent trust directors seated along one side of the conference table. Webb Calloran's forensic timeline was already mounted on the display screen. Blythe Carrow had been invited as an observer. Vesna sat separately beside a defense attorney, and she was no longer sitting near Graham. She had already contacted the prosecutor's office. She had already made a decision that had nothing to do with loyalty to the man who had prepared a document blaming her for the entire scheme before the arrest was even filed. At the far end of the table, a door opened. Reiner entered. She wore a simple slate-grey blazer. She carried a single folder. Her grandfather's watch was on her wrist. Graham stared. His expression moved through several distinct phases: surprise, then the beginning of understanding, then a controlled blankness she recognized as fear wearing a composed face. Bet Carmichael, 72-year-old chair of the Kincaid Property Trust's independent board, and the woman who had administered Arden Kincaid's estate for the past 9 years rose from her chair. "Raina Delara Kincaid," she said, "controlling beneficiary of the Kincaid Property Trust, registered owner of the ground lease on this building." Anson Halcott went very still. Theodora did not speak. For the first time in 11 years of dinners and sidelong comments and carefully calculated insults about Raina's clothes, her career, her family, her worth, she had nothing to say. Graham looked at the woman he had called financially dependent for the better part of a decade, the woman whose work he had presented as his own at 3 consecutive board reviews, the woman he had arrested while she was sitting still. "You lied to me," he said. Raina took her seat. "I disclosed a protected family trust in our prenuptial agreement. You signed it without reading the disclosure. I never told you the trust held this building because confidentiality rules prohibited it, and because I wanted one relationship in my life that knew me before knowing what I owned." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I had a letter prepared for our anniversary. I was going to tell you everything that afternoon. I found your property filings the same day I went to deliver it." Graham's jaw tightened. "You still controlled this building while you called my foundation a hobby," Raina said. "While you took credit for my lease analysis in front of your board. While you had me photographed leaving a police vehicle for a crime built from a signature you stole from a housing cooperative agreement." She did not raise her voice. "Yes, the entire time." Marsh opened the forensic timeline. Webb walked the room through every forged element, the cloned signature, the predated notarization, the shell entities tracing to Vesna, the IP address placing the authorization at Vesna's home network, while Raina was surrounded by witnesses, Graham's email to Osbert, referencing the warrant before the dinner was ever scheduled. Vesna, through her attorney, submitted a cooperation agreement with the prosecutor's office before the hearing concluded. It included text messages between her and Graham organizing the transfer filing, a voice memo of Graham instructing her to make the shell company name resemble the foundation closely enough that investigators would follow the trail to Raina before following it to either of them, and a drafted press release describing Raina as an opportunist who had used marriage to access the company, prepared and dated 1 week before the dinner, before the planted evidence had even been discovered. Osbert Raines resigned before the hearing formally closed. Anson sat very still for a long time after the forensic display ended. He had done business with Arden Kincaid decades ago, twice on commercial lending matters. He recognized the watch on Raina's wrist. He had seen it in a photograph on Arden's desk the last time they met. "I should have questioned Graham's accounting reports 2 years ago," Anson said. "I was protecting the family name instead of protecting the truth." Raina owed him nothing. She gave him honesty instead. "The workers in this building need continuity. I've asked the trust directors to protect payroll and essential operations while the board restructures. The company can survive this. Graham's authority over it cannot." Anson lowered his head. The independent directors moved to suspend Graham's signatory access pending the criminal investigation. The Halcott board convened an emergency session and voted to remove him as chief executive. Vesna's credentials were revoked. A temporary financial supervisor was appointed to manage daily treasury approvals. The pharmaceutical contract was preserved through a clean draw processed under independent oversight. The workers kept their jobs. The building stayed open. It had always stayed open. Arden Kincaid had built it that way. 3 months later, a Charlotte courtroom entered the final dismissal of every charge against Raina. Graham entered guilty pleas to fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy on a Tuesday in October. Vesna accepted a reduced charge in exchange for her cooperation testimony. Osbert Raines has faced professional disciplinary review. Each of them had, in the end, tried to become the smallest part of the conspiracy. None of them had succeeded in being small enough. On the morning of the guilty plea, Theodora Halcott sent a letter to Raina through Osbert's replacement counsel. The letter said that if Theodora had known who Raina's grandfather was, she would have treated her differently. Raina read the letter once, folded it, and set it aside. The woman Theodora had humiliated for 11 years had deserved fair treatment long before she knew what Raina owned. That was the part Theodora still had not understood, and Raina did not believe she ever would. June Halcott, 33-year-old younger sister of Graham, and the only member of the Halcott family who had provided evidence without being compelled to do so, called that same afternoon. June had submitted the security footage of Vesna entering the executive floor after hours. She had done it before she knew about the trust, before she understood how far the evidence would reach. She had done it because she had watched Raina stay late to help a displaced family the same week. Graham had taken credit for 3 of her budget analyses, and something in her had decided that silence was no longer a price she was willing to keep paying. "I should have spoken earlier," June said. "Yes," Reiner said, "but you did speak." That was the limit of what she offered. Gratitude without absolution. Courage arriving late still mattered. It did not erase the cost someone else paid while it was still being gathered. The Kincaid Community Housing Foundation reopened fully within 6 weeks. Some sponsors returned with apologies. Others offered large donations and used the word Kincaid in a way that made clear they were buying proximity to the trust rather than investing in housing families. Reiner returned their checks with a letter explaining the foundation's donor standards and invitation to apply again with a transparent program proposal. The Kincaid Property Trust retained independent governance. Reiner accepted a non-executive stewardship role focused on ethical tenant practices, affordable commercial lease programs, and counseling for small non-profit tenants facing displacement. The building's independent board retained its authority. No operational decision was hers alone to make. Her grandfather had taught her that owning something meant being answerable to it, not using it as a weapon, and not hiding behind it as armor. On the day the foundation reopened its housing fair, Reiner arrived early and stayed late. She sat beside a woman who had been wrongly evicted through a fraudulent sublease scheme and helped her understand the complaint process. She stayed until every family had a clear next step. She drove home in the dark past the downtown tower with Arden Kincaid's name nowhere on its facade. He had removed it before he died. He had said that buildings wearing their owners' names confused the building with the owner and got both of them into trouble. On her desk back at the foundation, a new case file waited. Across the top, in Marcia's handwriting, urgent employee facing termination through forged performance records. Signature matches nothing in their file. Reiner set her grandfather's watch beside the folder. She opened the page. Her own case was closed, but the truth had already found the next person who needed someone with the patience to listen and the standing to act.